Welcome to the 19th episode of our show, The Second Sex, where we explore Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work and its lasting impact on feminist thought.
Hello.
Today, we're diving deep into a really crucial part of this foundational text, Chapter 5 of Part 2, Situation, the one titled The Mother, specifically pages 591-648.
Right. And in this section, de Beauvoir really, she dissects motherhood. She goes way beyond just the biological act.
Yeah.
She looks at how society constructs this role, and how that construction shapes women's lives, their actual position in the social fabric.
So our aim today is really to unpack her analysis of how this idea of mother gets created, how it's understood, and, well, what the consequences are.
Exactly. What are the implications?
And crucially, she starts way back, doesn't she? Looking at the historical, even the mythological roots of how motherhood got tied to women's primary role.
Yes. She argues that in, really early human societies, the biological facts of reproduction plus the emerging economic structures, well, those actually paved the way for male dominance.
How so?
Well, what's fascinating is her point about tools. With the invention of tools, male activities suddenly became linked with progress, with the future, shaping what's next.
Okay.
Whereas motherhood, well, that stayed connected to the body, didn't it? And just the continuation of the species. Immediate, but not seen as progressive in the same way.
So a fundamental split in perception right from the start, based on activity.
A fundamental split, yes. How men and women were seen in relation to time, to advancement.
And this split, this is where the concept of woman as other comes in.
That's right. Man defines himself as the default, the norm. Woman becomes the other, different and often, well, subordinate.
But then you have the worship of goddesses, the great mother figures.
Yeah.
Ishtar, Gaia, Isis. That seems contradictory, doesn't it?
It does on the surface.
Yeah.
But de Beauvoir's insight here is that even when women were sort of elevated to this divine status, seen as powerful, maybe even feared, that prestige ultimately came from male consciousness. Men created these ideas.
Oh, okay.
It's like fertile earth. Intensely powerful, yes, but still something seen as needing cultivation, ultimately under male control. It set the stage.
So acknowledging women's vital role in reproduction didn't actually lead to equality.
Not at all. In fact, she argues it often just reinforced the idea of man as the essential one, the one doing the acknowledging, the defining.
Right.
And she points to how this played out practically. In some societies, husbands essentially buying wives or exchanging goods for them, it shows a kind of transactional view.
Which sounds like it just cemented a patriarchal structure even further.
Precisely. As societies moved more towards patriarchy, men developed a stronger sense of self, of agency.
And they started asserting their will more.
They did. Even if they were maybe mystified by nature or fertility, they didn't actually give up power. They just framed women's roles within their worldview.
So how did this power dynamic play out in the actual treatment of women, especially mothers? De Beauvoir gives some, well, pretty disturbing examples.
She really does. I mean, the very acceptance of a baby girl could be seen as a kind of generosity from the father, not her inherent right to exist.
That's chilling.
And the practice of female infanticide in some ancient Arab cultures is just a stark example of this devaluation.
And this lower value wasn't just about existence, it extended further.
Oh, absolutely. The idea of the stain of birth being worse for mothers of girls, like the longer cleansing periods in Hebrew tradition, that says a lot.
It does.
And then there's the blood money, the compensation for injury or death, lower for women than men in many systems. It literally quantified their lesser value.
It really paints a picture of women as almost like property.
It does. You see it in the father's total power over his daughter until marriage, and then that control just gets handed over to the husband.
An object to be exchanged.
Essentially, yes. Exchange between men.
And this control, it definitely included their sexuality, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about polygamy generally accepted for men, right? But women. Rigorous chastity was demanded.
Though she does mention exceptions in some matriarchal societies.
Yes, she's careful to note it wasn't universal. Some cultures had different views on prenuptial chastity. But the patriarchal trend was strong.
And in those patriarchal societies, female infidelity was treated very harshly. Why the big difference?
Well, it mainly came down to lineage, inheritance. Ensuring the legitimacy of the male heirs was absolutely critical.
So female fidelity was key to maintaining that system.
Exactly. And legal systems, like the Napoleonic Code much later, reflected this inequality for a long time in how they treated adultery.
De Beauvoir also talks about physical confinement, like the gynecium in ancient Greece. the women's
Yeah,
quarters.
yeah, that physical separation.
Hmm.
And she points out the really quite strong misogyny in the writings of major Greek figures, Homer, Hesiod, Pericles, Aristotle.
Lots of writers, actually.
Lots of them consistently portraying one negatively. Plato is maybe a slight exception, suggesting some education for girls, but
But those ideas didn't really stick, did they? Even looking much later, like the French Revolution, there was some initial talk of women's rights.
a significant backlash followed. Figures like Olympe de Gouges, who really pushed for women's rights, were suppressed.
So the revolutionary ideals didn't apply to women.
Not in any lasting, meaningful way, no. Traditional gender roles were reinforced pretty firmly.
Okay, moving forward in history a bit, de Beauvoir looks at working women and mothers, especially during the Industrial Revolution.
Right. And here, she highlights a kind of cynical exploitation. Women were often seen as more docile, more manageable workers, especially if they had families to support. Even Marx noted this.
So qualities that might be seen positively were actually turned against them.
Exactly. Their perceived gentleness, their economic vulnerability, these were used to keep them in, well, pretty terrible conditions. Enslaved in the factories, really.
It's disturbing that even some early reformers,
Like Sismondi and Blanqui, yes. Seeing the awful conditions, their initial reaction, perhaps out of a kind of protective concern, was actually to call for excluding women from workshops altogether.
which points to some of the deep contradictions in women's legal and social status that de Beauvoir discusses.
Yes, like the weird paradox where single women, even prostitutes sometimes, might have had more legal capacity than married women.
Despite the huge social stigma they faced.
Right, and the fact that something like free love wasn't necessarily illegal, but adultery was a crime, it just screams double standard.
It really does.
She even mentions that kind of counterintuitive thing where some young women married partly to gain a bit of freedom for affairs, which just shows how restrictive marriage itself felt.
What about women who did achieve great things historically? How does de Beauvoir account for them?
Well, her argument is that these exceptional women often succeeded when their social role allowed them to transcend typical femininity.
Like queens.
Exactly. Isabella the Catholic, Elizabeth of England, Catherine the Great, their power came from being sovereigns. Or religious figures like Catherine of Siena, Saint Teresa, they operated in a sphere that gave them a different kind of authority.
It makes you think about all the potential that was just lost.
It really does. De Beauvoir suggests that when women were denied positive ways to exert influence, they sometimes turned to more indirect, maybe even negative forms. Intrigue, conspiracy, fighting in revolutions.
And religion itself, which could offer comfort, also played a role in keeping this imbalance.
A complex role, yes.
Yeah.
She analyzes the Genesis creation story, for instance. Eve created from Adam, for Adam. It sets up a hierarchy right there. Woman as secondary, almost inessential.
Establishing that framework for men to see women as naturally subordinate.
Right. Leading to this view of woman as a privileged prey, as she puts it, a naturally submissive consciousness that man hopes to fulfill himself through. It's a perspective, she notes, no man would accept for himself.
And that justifies controlling women.
It certainly provides a justification, yes. Men, fathers, brothers, husbands become responsible for a woman's chastity, controlling her behavior, her sexuality.
But at the same time, there's this constant suspicion of women being unfaithful.
Yes, that deep-seated doubt. Think of the legends Genevieve de Brabant, Desdemona, Griselda, all readily suspected. The burden of proof was always on the woman.
It's that impossible double demand she talks about.
Exactly. Wanting woman to be totally his, but also somehow exotic and mysterious. Submissive servant and alluring sorceress. Though usually only the servant part was openly valued.
She gets quite specific looking at certain male writers, like Munderland.
Yes, she uses him as a strong example, analyzing how his characters often choose sort of pathetic sweethearts, as she calls them, seemingly just to feel superior themselves.
Boosting their own ego by putting women down.
Essentially. And that passage from The Girls, comparing Solange needing the toilet to a horse, it's just brutal in its dehumanization.
Really shows a contempt for the female body, for basic autonomy.
It's a very powerful illustration of the kind of deep-seated misogyny she's uncovering.
But she does offer a contrasting view with D.H. Lawrence.
She does. Lawrence, particularly in Women in Love, or Lady Chatterley's Lover, aimed for something different. A vision of balanced reciprocal sexuality, a star equilibrium.
Where both are distinct but equal.
Yes, achieving a kind of profound mutual fulfillment connected to something almost primal, what he called a correspondence of blood.
But de Beauvoir is ultimately critical of even this kind of idealization, right?
She is. She critiques the whole concept of the myth of woman, the static idol that gets in the way of real relationships with actual autonomous people.
She quotes Laforgue, wanting women as equal companions.
Right. Moving beyond those limiting stereotypes is key.
So real appreciation only comes when women are seen as peers.
That's what she suggests. Maybe more like in the 18th century, she hints, the myth itself becomes an obstacle to authenticity.
Okay, let's shift to the individual experience. The girl's journey towards womanhood and the mother's role in that.
Right. She talks about how even childhood games can subtly push girls towards passivity, even if their natural inclination is towards activity, towards independence. Early conditioning is powerful.
And the mother figure, who you'd think would be a guide, can become someone to resist.
Sometimes, yes. The girl might see the maternal world as kind of narrow, maybe stifling. She might want to escape that very intimate authority. De Beauvoir acknowledges it's complex, though ranging from understanding, like Colette Cito, to really damaging, domineering relationships.
And then come the physical changes, adolescence.
Yes, menstruation, a developing awareness of her own eroticism. It shifts things. Even normal family affection might suddenly feel different as she becomes aware of her body in a new way.
Which can be confusing, maybe even lead to difficult situations.
Definitely. De Beauvoir mentions the emotional turmoil and the real danger of unwelcome attention or advances from older people, which can be incredibly damaging.
This ties into the anxieties of female adolescents she discusses, like the fear of sexual violence.
Yes, those disturbing fantasies of rape that can haunt young girls. She interprets them less as desire and more as reflecting societal power dynamics and deep anxieties about their emerging sexuality.
And often the relationship with the father changes too.
It can, yes. A growing awareness of boundaries, maybe a new sense of unease or even disgust, can develop as her own sexuality awakens.
That dream she mentions, being raped with the mother's consent.
She sees that symbolically, a sort of desire for permission to embrace her own desires, but trapped within a society that demands innocence and enforces hypocrisy.
It's that impossible bind again. Be pure, but you're also becoming sexual.
Exactly. That pressure can lead to self-denial, real unhappiness, and inhibitions that stick around. Marie Basque-Herseff's experiences are a really painful example she uses.
De Beauvoir also brings up the idea of violence, or rather, the ability to exert physical force.
Yes, the idea that being able to physically assert yourself is crucial for feeling like a subject, not an object. Lacking that capacity can lead to deep frustration, a sense of powerlessness. She draws parallels to other oppressed groups.
Highlighting the difference between boys and girls in adolescence.
Right. Boys are often encouraged to test boundaries, challenge the world. Girls, often taught to submit, lacking that core belief in their own physical power, which can lead to a more general timidity.
Which sets them on very different paths as they grow up.
Very different. The boy moves towards independence, social value. The girl faces this conflict. Her human desire for agency versus the prescribed feminine vocation of passivity. It's a really difficult, decisive moment.
That agonizing dilemma she describes.
That's it. The clash between wanting to be a subject, an actor in her own life, and the immense pressure to become a passive object for others.
And this conflict can manifest psychologically, narcissism, masochism.
Yes. The intense focus on pleasing others, on her image in the male gaze, can lead to narcissism. And that can link to masochism seeking fulfillment by submitting to a powerful other. Think Bluebeard or Murdered Saints.
It's about finding her value through him.
Exactly. Seeking out a superior male to idealize, hoping his splendor will somehow reflect onto her, make her indispensable.
But this often doesn't work out in real life.
Rarely. The ideal rarely matches reality. This can lead to disillusionment, rejecting real men because they don't fit the fantasy. She even notes a tendency sometimes to be drawn to unattainable men, perhaps reinforcing that idealized image and masking a fear of actual intimacy.
De Beauvoir does acknowledge that young women might misuse their freedom initially.
Yes, she's realistic about that. Early steps towards independence might be messy, even negative. But she also sees the potential for developing positive qualities, empathy, devotion, understanding. She points to heroines in Rosamund Lehmann's novels.
So there's potential for growth.
Absolutely. Though even characters like Judy and Dusty Answer, who seem quite free, often still have that underlying attitude of expectation towards the other.
There's that striking image she paints of a young woman getting ready to go out, embracing her appearance.
Yes, that moment of consciously using adornment, not just passively, but feeling a sense of power, readiness to engage with the world almost as an equal in that specific context. It's a fascinating passage.
But then she talks about early sexual encounters that lack real feeling.
Right. Engaging sexually out of curiosity or defiance or just a sort of cold rationality without genuine arousal or connection. These deflowered virgins, as she calls them, might still hold on to a kind of prudishness, a resistance to real sensuality, which can cause issues later.
She also touches on the lesbian perspective here.
Yes, viewing it as a way of rejecting those traditional feminine roles and refusing to be defined by the male gaze. Even clothing choices can signify that rejection of being primarily a sexual object for men.
And she explores some of the complexities within that.
She does, like the potential attraction to both masculine traits and feminine softness, and the often ambiguous relationship with men, indifference, maybe scorn, sometimes even feelings of inferiority because of societal pressures.
And the first sexual experience itself can be deeply negative.
Very much so. De Beauvoir is quite graphic about how fear, ignorance, male clumsiness, or even aggression can make it traumatic, not intimate. The examples she gives are quite harrowing.
Okay, shifting focus to the domestic sphere again, housework.
Housework. It might seem like a game at first, she says, but it quickly becomes this endless, repetitive cycle, like Sisyphus never truly achieving anything lasting, just maintaining the present.
That story of the southern poor white woman.
Who could never make her place feel like a real home, yes. It captures that sense of futility of work that doesn't conquer anything positive.
And this contributes to frustration in marriage.
Definitely. Isabelle de Charrier's example is powerful, seeking intellectual partnership, but finding yourself bogged down in boring chores, feeling totally stifled.
De Beauvoir uses strong language. She says traditional marriage can mutilate women.
She does, arguing it locks them into routine, cuts them off from broader possibilities for growth. And she points out the husband's contradictory demands, wanting total devotion, but also wanting his wife to be almost weightless, present but not nagging, his but somehow not belonging to him.
Sophia Tolstoy's frustrations come up here too.
Yes, that yearning for real reciprocity highlights the power imbalance. De Beauvoir brings in Lawrence, again, true union needs autonomy, and of course Nora, in A Doll's House, realizing she has to be a person first.
Then she really challenges the idea of the unnatural mother.
Right. She basically says maternal love isn't some automatic instinct. It's not inherently natural, therefore bad mothers exist. It's not a shocking anomaly. She even nods to psychoanalysis, recognizing the harm normal parents can inflict.
Which exposes a societal hypocrisy.
Totally. Society denies women public roles, says they're incapable, yet trusts them with the vital job of raising children. She mentions Montesquieu's wry comment that women might be better at governing the state than a family.
Why does she think that might be?
Perhaps because in more abstract roles, they can rise above the expectations tied to their sex more easily. At home, she suggests, women might let themselves go, act more indulgently or illogically, just as men might in private, which can be problematic when parenting.
And there's the conflict between being a perfect housewife and a good mother.
A huge conflict. Constant tidying versus a child's needs. Maternal love getting lost in endless reprimands. It leads to stress, bitterness, a feeling of never quite succeeding.
And ultimately, the woman stuck at home struggles to define herself as an individual.
That's the core argument. She's seen as a type servant, wife, mother, rather than a unique person establishing her own existence.
Even self-adornment, fashion, gets a critical look.
Yes, because society encourages women to alienate themselves in their image, presenting themselves as objects for male desire rather than fashion serving their own projects or self-expression in the way men's clothing often signifies status or role.
She also discusses prostitution.
And challenges the idea that prostitutes are somehow inherently different, like criminals. She argues it's largely driven by economic need, lack of work, low wages created by male demand. So society, acting surprised or judgmental, is deeply hypocritical.
What about aging women in this framework?
It's often a bleak picture, like Colette's character Sherry, finding freedom from constraints just when there's seemingly nothing left to do with it. Patriarchy makes feminine roles servile, so women escape that slavery only when they're seen as no longer productive.
A stark contrast to men reaching peak power later in life.
Exactly. Men hitting their stride at 50, while women are often forced into retirement, feeling useless after dedicating their lives to others.
Religion comes up again as both solace and oppressor.
Yes. Offered as a mirage of transcendence, a compensation for being stuck in immanence. Male-dominated religions often reinforce male authority.
But it can meet a real need for women.
Oh, certainly. Especially in modern times, it can offer a sense of equality before God, a way to cope with earthly injustices. She notes how girls might find salvation in God's gaze, canceling out male privilege in that realm.
Though she mentions strong female saints who defied male authority.
Yes, figures like St. Bridget, St. Catherine, Joan of Arc, St. Teresa, they showed incredible strength. But she adds that the church generally makes sure God doesn't actually authorize women to escape male guardianship overall.
And she returns to how women internalize being seen as objects.
Right. Conditioned from childhood, reinforced by education, puberty, it sinks deep. She even mentions cases where women mentally split themselves in solitary pleasure, becoming both the male subject looking and the female object being looked at.
You can't positively be other for yourself, she argues.
Exactly. It's inherently alienating.
Which makes the experience of abandonment so devastating.
Absolutely. When a woman has poured her entire being into a man, being left can feel like a complete annihilation of self. That question, what can I do now? From the woman left at 40, it's heartbreaking.
She contrasts this with women who had the resources to rebuild.
Yes, figures like Heloise or Colette's heroines, women with inner strength or external support. It's a warning against that generous mistake of total self-surrender.
Authentic love has to be different.
Based on reciprocal recognition of two freedoms. Two subjects, not a subject and an object.
Are there any exceptions? Women who manage to combine femininity and independence. She mentions actresses.
Yes, actresses, dancers, singers. Their careers can actually reinforce their femininity while giving them real independence. Professional success boosts their sexual value, potentially allowing a fulfillment as both human being and woman.
An appearance becomes part of the job, potentially satisfying.
Exactly. Adornment, beauty care are professional duties. Though she notes great actresses aim beyond that, towards genuine art.
And finally, what about women writers?
She credits them with powerful critiques of society. But she also brings up Virginia Woolf's point. Women writers historically spent so much energy just fighting constraints.
That they had less left for the actual creative work compared to men.
Potentially, yes. So while achieving great lucidity, de Beauvoir suggests they might still be too invested in the cause of women to reach a fully disinterested, objective stance.
Dismantling illusions is vital, but more is needed.
Right. True understanding requires going further, rethinking and recreating reality, not just exposing its flaws.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive into de Beauvoir's analysis of the mother. It really shows how deeply rooted this historical construction of motherhood is. Its role in patriarchy, the devaluation of women, the complex psychological and social results.
It's incredibly layered. And understanding these long-standing forces, as she lays them out so clearly, is just, well, it's essential for grasping the ongoing fight for real gender equality.
Absolutely. And on that thought, here's something for you, our listeners, to mull over. In what ways, maybe subtle ways, do these historical patterns and expectations around motherhood still shape our own experiences today? How do they influence current debates about women's roles, women's identities? What parts of de Beauvoir's analysis really hit home for you in the world right now?